morning, everybody. Can I say that today we're joined by the Emergency Services Minister, Steph Cook, Damien Johnson, the Deputy Commissioner of the New South Wales SES, and Diane Eadie from the Bureau. Can I begin by thanking everybody across our state for following the instructions that have been issued by our emergency services personnel. Those instructions are there to keep people safe, and it's incredibly pleasing from the feedback that I've received from our emergency services that everybody, in the main, is following those instructions, and that's ensured that we're able to keep people safe in what has been a very difficult time. We currently have 74 evacuation orders in place across our state, 36 evacuation warnings, so that's affecting over 60,000 people across New South Wales. That number is still high, whilst, as Diane will point out, we're seeing some easing weather conditions across the state, which is good news. There are still a number of those orders in place and a number of those warnings. So please continue to follow those instructions. If those evacuation warnings are in place, please get ready to evacuate, and if those orders are in place, please leave as soon as you can. In the last 24 hours, we've had 50 flood rescues across the state. We've had over 1,000 requests for assistance. So I particularly want to thank the SES, the RFS, Marine Rescue, and Surf Lifesaving, all our teams who are out there day and night making sure people are kept safe. I think everyone would have been moved to see the rescue of that 10-month-old baby. Incredibly moving scenes, and I want to thank Lee Archer and Shane Dowsett from Surf Lifesaving. I think those pictures demonstrate to us the wonderful spirit of service in our country, and that great volunteerism that gets people through day in, day out. Those pictures, I think, really bring home the extent of this event, but also the vulnerability that people face in very difficult circumstances. But what trumps all of that is that wonderful spirit of service that Australians have in putting their own lives on the line to help others. Yesterday, I met Alex Turner out in Hawkesbury with the Prime Minister and the Emergency Services Minister, Steph Cook, who's a member of the SES in Hunters Hill, out in Hawkesbury, volunteering again, looking after those local communities. Now, I'd met Alex in November last year in Forbes, where he'd gone to help the Forbes community during the flood event that occurred there. And I think that tells a story of so many people in uniform who are volunteers, who move from town to town, place to place, day in, day out, looking after people, taking time off their jobs, taking time away from their families to help others. So can I thank all those volunteers who are out there keeping people safe. We still have 11 evacuation centres across New South Wales that's providing care and support for those who need it. We have around 1,000 SES volunteers on the ground today. There are a number of inspections in terms of damage assessments for properties, over 700 that have occurred, and that work is being carried out. We continue to work with the federal government in relation to the releasing of funds and making sure that the financial assistance is being provided to those who need it as quickly as possible. But once again, can I thank people for following those instructions? I do have to say again, even though the weather is easing, there are still concerns, particularly up north, around Singleton, Hunter Valley and Maitland, in those areas. So please continue to follow those orders. Of those 50 rescues that have occurred in the last 24 hours, a number of those rescues are still people in vehicles driving through floodwaters. So please do not drive through floodwaters. We say this every press conference, and we say it for a reason, because people continue to do it. Please don't make an assessment that you can get through those floodwaters. Please just don't take that risk. You're putting yourself, your family, your friends at risk, and also our volunteers who are on the ground to carry out those rescues. So can I again thank everybody for following those instructions, but particularly today, thank the volunteers. You really, I think, make our state and our people proud and our country proud, and that is the great spirit of Australians right across the board. So thank you, and now I'm going to pass it to Steph Cook.
Well, thank you, Premier, and good morning. And it's very pleasing to see that the weather situation is starting to ease after almost a week of relentless rain, which has caused widespread flooding right across the Sydney metropolitan area, the Central Coast, the Illawarra, and now, of course, as we've seen over the last day or so, up through the Hunter Valley and mid-North Coast areas. So we did see significant rainfall across the Hunter region yesterday. We'll shortly get an update from the Bureau of Meteorology on what some of those rainfall totals were. But pleasingly, we are starting to see the situation up there also ease. So as the weather situation changes and the flooding emergency is winding down, the recovery efforts are winding up. So the SES has conducted near on 800 rapid damage assessments in the past 24 hours, and those rapid damage assessments will start to ramp up as areas are cleared and people are able to return to their homes. So the importance of this activity is to ensure that people are returning to a safe environment in their home. And so as those floodwaters recede, communities will start to see the emergency services move into their suburbs, going street by street, house by house, assessing their homes and making sure that an all clear is given before people are actually able to return. So I'd like to respectfully ask that for people that have been impacted by floodwaters going through their home, please take caution as you return home over the coming days. It does present new hazards, and we want to ensure that people do remain safe through this time. So please, people looking to perhaps dry their homes out after what has been, a week of very, very wet weather, please take care when you're using appliances in the home. Please keep your clothes at least a metre away from your heaters. Please don't use outdoor heating equipment and outdoor cooking equipment inside. There are carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide risks, and we certainly don't want to see people's lives put at risk through these activities. Look, it's been an incredible effort by our emergency services so far through this event to get through without loss of life, and certainly working closely with communities to ensure that. It's testimony to and full credit to our emergency services for their efforts and to the community for working so closely with us over the past week. So as the return to home begins, I'm just really asking people to stay vigilant at this time. I know people are desperate to get back into their homes and see what damage has occurred and really start to think through what those next steps are for them. We just don't want to see heartbreak on top of what has been a really, really difficult time for communities. And we know already through the start of this winter season, we've already seen 5 deaths through house fires, which is more than we saw for all of winter in 2021. So I'm really asking people, please be very vigilant as you return home. We want to avoid any tragedy on top of the heartache that we've already experienced over the past week. So we'd, as the Premier has indicated, really like to implore communities just to continue working through with the emergency services, keep an eye on the Bureau of Meteorology. We are starting to see those weather conditions ease, which is incredibly pleasing. And I think finally, I'd really like, in my capacity as Minister for Emergency Services, reiterate some of the messaging of the Premier and just say how deeply grateful I am to each and every member of our emergency services organisations, both the personnel and the volunteers. We've had over 2,500 SES volunteers out in the field over the past week. I've said on a number of occasions, and the Premier alluded to it earlier, we've seen one flooding emergency in this state after another since November last year. Our emergency services workers, particularly the SES volunteers, continue to move around the state as one situation unfolds and leads into another. Right now we have significant flooding in the west of the state, which doesn't really get much airtime in relation to the emergency that we've been dealing with at the moment. But I really want to acknowledge the efforts of the SES right across New South Wales, and they are so well supported by our other emergency services organisations and their volunteers. And I really want to say to each and every volunteer today, I hear your stories of heroics and your courage around the clock. I'm always getting messages and phone calls just relaying back to me all of the efforts that you've gone to in relation to flood rescues, to keeping people safe, the near misses, and how you're all working together to support each other. I couldn't be more proud, but I'm more than anything just so deeply grateful to you, to your families, to your employers, because when we all pull together, we can get some really good outcomes for our communities, and just really want to say thank you. I'll now pass over to Diana Eadie, who will give us a weather update. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Over the past 24 hours, we've seen extraordinary rainfall totals. However, the most significant activity has now moved offshore of the New South Wales coast. That being said, there's still a number of significant flood warnings in place that I'd like to walk you through today. But starting with the rainfall totals, we've seen widespread 100 to 300 millimetres over the past 24 hours, particularly around the mid-north coast. And some of the highlight figures, they're 305 millimetres at Taree and 213 at Foster. Now, of course, this has resulted in some significant increase in terms of flood activity once again in those areas, and there's now a moderate flood watch in place for the Manning River, with the potential that we could see those river levels rise to 3 metres at Taree. Of course, there's still major flooding elsewhere that I'd like to focus on today, including in particular the Wombai Brook and Lower Hunter area, the Hawkesbury Nepean, the Macquarie, but also Tuggerah Lakes as well, where we're still seeing ongoing major flooding. I'll start with Wombai Brook and the Lower Hunter. So for Bulga, we saw 9.1 metres, which is the highest river level that we've seen since 1952. Those conditions are currently easing, but will remain at major for some time yet. Singleton was an area of concern overnight. It looks likely now that we've seen that peak at around 13.71 metres, which has exceeded the level that we saw in March 2022. Good news for the Singleton area is that it is likely now that we will start to see those river levels decrease. That being said, Maitland is still at risk, and we could potentially see major flooding in the Maitland area of 10.5 metres. So we're urging people in those communities to make sure that you stay on top of the latest forecasts and warnings for those areas. Now to the Hawkesbury and Nepean rivers, we're seeing the river levels slowly decrease in those areas, but still around the major level for North Richmond, Windsor, Sackville and Wiseman's Ferry. So only a very slow decreasing trend. There's still a lot of water flowing through those catchments. So please, again, make sure that you're using caution when you're around the water in those areas and you're staying up to date with the latest forecasts for those rivers. And the good news is, in terms of looking ahead, while those river level conditions will only slowly start to lower, it does look likely that we're not going to see a return of those significant rainfall totals in the days ahead. So looking forward, really just very coastal showers over the next few days. We could see some shower activity on the Sunday, but at this stage, not expecting anything like what we've seen in the past few days to return to New South Wales over the next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. As we've heard from the Bureau that there's better weather on its way, but there's still risks that continue. Our focus, as anticipated yesterday, was on the mid-north coast area, on the Hunter and other areas as well. That has resulted in significant operational activity with the focus in those key areas as well. I'd urge the public to continue to heed the warnings, and especially the evacuation orders and the evacuation warnings, and follow all directions from SES and emergency services personnel. I'd like to thank the public who are continuing to follow the directions of the emergency services. We are still seeing a number of flood rescues. Most of those are as a result of being in vehicles. So once again, can people please adhere to the warnings and not enter into waters, especially if you're in vehicles or on foot or other mechanisms as well. You can put both the SES volunteers and other emergency services in harm's way, and that's not something I'd like us to be doing, if we can avoid those circumstances. Whilst we continue to monitor and operationally respond to the Hunter and the Mid-North Coast area, within the Sydney area we have seen that easing more generally of the weather. We will see the rivers reduce in size and height. Whilst that is occurring, we will continue to work on return safely notices. We will work quickly with that and our emergency service partners so we can allow people to get back in and assess their homes, but also return and do that safely. There are significant risks when you do return to flooded homes and other premises that have been inundated. You can have contaminated waters, contaminated waste, debris, and other risks such as electrical risks as well. So it's important that you monitor those risks and that you actually ensure that you actually don't put yourself in harm's way when you do return to those premises. There's been some wonderful stories from our SES volunteers and emergency services that you've seen in the media in recent days. I'd like to thank both the SES volunteers, who are people that live in your communities and choose to be well trained and be highly professional in what they do. It is important to thank them, and we thank both the SES volunteers, their employers. Now this response has been going on for quite some time now. We've obviously had the floods early in the year as well. Employers are allowing volunteers to respond and support their other members of the community during their time of need. The other people that are quite often forgotten with the SES volunteers and other emergency and volunteer services is family and friends. They give up time and their personal time with their family and friends to give back to the community, both their training, weekends, and then obviously during this urgent response as well when we have flooding events. And over the last 18 months plus, we've seen significant events where they've given up significant periods of time to do that. Now, as I mentioned, it's continuing to adhere to the warnings. There are significant risks still occurring with those river systems, especially up in the Hunter area, Cessnock, Singleton, and the like, and also in that mid-north coast. So the risks have not left. Also in the Greater Sydney, as the rivers do subside, there are continued river rises, well not rises, but continued heights that do pose a danger, and you need to ensure you adhere to the warnings. They have not dissipated as yet. We will continue to advise when those warnings and orders are brought off and the return safely notices are occurred. If you need additional information in regards to managing your risk, go to the SES website. If you need assistance from the SES, 132 500. And in the case of emergency response that is life-threatening, please call 000. Thank you.
Questions?
In terms of the next 24, 48 hours, where will the focus be? Are we likely to see any more major flooding with that system moving off the coast, or will it, are we kind of looking towards recovery mode?
We are looking towards recovery mode. We are monitoring still the river systems, and as the Bureau and Dinah outlined in terms of we're seeing those river falls and hopefully the major peaks actually occurring and actually subsiding. And we will continue to operationally respond both within the Hunter or the Greater Metropolitan City and the like as well, but the Hunter and the mid-north coast areas as well. But we hope we're over the worst of it, and it will be continuing to monitor those risks ongoing.
With what we saw in March and April, both here and up in Lismore, flooding in quick succession, is that a risk in the next month or so, do you think?
I'd probably, it's more a question for the Bureau in terms of future weather systems, but certainly the outlook from the Bureau for the rest of this period of time and also leading into summer as well. But I might hand on to Diana to talk to that.
In terms of the conditions in the months ahead, our seasonal outlook is indicating that we will see above average rainfall persisting through this month. In terms of the climatological drivers that are delivering that, we've got warmer sea surface temperatures over in the Indian Ocean at the moment. So the Indian Ocean dipole is feeding more moisture across New South Wales. We're also in a positive phase of the southern annular mode as well, which means that we're seeing more moisture being dragged off the Coral and Tasman Sea. So those conditions mean that there's still definitely the potential there for significant rain-bearing systems to develop. In terms of the 7-day outlook, fortunately we're not seeing that at the moment, but we will continue to monitor as these sorts of systems could potentially develop in the weeks ahead. We are still very much in East Coast low season. As we start to progress into more the summer months as well, we could see those sorts of conditions develop again. But all the climate indicators are suggesting that we'll see a continuation of wetter conditions. In terms of how that plays out and the specific features, that's something that we at the Bureau will be keeping a close eye on and communicating to the public and emergency services as soon as we start to see features of risk.
Premier, you've been really proactive after Lismore with the inquiries and so forth, but you were confronted yourself and the Prime Minister with a few people yesterday who said, look, nothing's been done over 12 years in terms of long-term mitigation.
Yeah.
How are you going to respond to those claims?
Well, firstly, I can certainly appreciate the stress, the frustration and the anguish that many people have, particularly in areas like the Hawkesbury, where they've had 4 events in quick succession. It's one after the other after the other. Now, governments, the point that is made that Scott made is completely valid. You can't just be focusing on the short term. You've got to focus on medium to long-term solutions as well, and that's exactly what the government's looking at. Issues like the raising of the Warragamba Dam wall are not simple. It's actually work that kicked off many years ago in terms of the Hawkesbury Nepean area and how do we deal with these major flood events going forward, because they will happen again. It's naive to think they won't. So we have submitted those proposals and are working with the Commonwealth Government and seeking a 50-50 funding arrangement in relation to that. But that's just one issue of which there are many. We have to look at better planning going forward. We need to make sure that from a mitigation perspective and a resilience perspective, we're in a much stronger position to be able to deal with various natural disasters that are going to come our way into the future. And I don't want to be in a position in 10 or 20 years where we're sitting here saying, well, we should have done this back in 2022. That's where we need to act, not just for today, but for years to come. And that work's being undertaken. I think the review we'll get back from the inquiry into the review that's taking place in relation to the Northern Rivers will inform the government of things that we can do in the medium to long term. And I can tell you that they're already under active consideration a range of measures going forward. I don't want to do the same old thing, the same old way going forward. These events are going to keep happening and we need to make sure our communities are resilient. The final point I'd make is our communities are actually quite resilient compared to other places around the world. Like, when it comes to our communities, they've naturally been built up over time to deal with the natural disasters that we face in this country, but we clearly need to do better. And I don't want to have a situation when the next flood hits or the next bushfires come that we're sitting here thinking we should have done more.
Premier, we're looking at yet another
hefty
clean-up this time round. What impact are these repeat flood events having on the state budget?
Oh, well, they have, they always have an impact on the budget. But ultimately, the budget's not there for the sake of it. The budget's there to help our people. And we put $4.5 billion into drought response. We put $4.5 billion into our support for those communities that were affected by the bushfires. There's over $3 billion in Commonwealth and state support for the impacts that occurred during the Northern Rivers floods and more broadly the floods that occurred earlier in the year. And no doubt we will see, as a result of this flood, more financial support. But that's important. The budget's not there as an end of itself. The budget's there to help our people. That's the focus of it. We won't spare a dollar to make sure that every single person in these communities gets back on their feet as quickly as possible.
So if we have 2 or 3 more of these events this year, will you be able to deal with that financially?
Yes.
Just in regards to yesterday and seeing those victims in Windsor, there was, not regarding a natural disaster, but some hesitancy from leaders at the federal election to actually mix with punters for fear that something was going to happen. You as a politician seem to be taking a different tact. Why is that?
Oh, I mean, your job as the leader of the state is to get on the ground and speak to people.
But we've seen leaders in recent years
And
not doing
that's
that.
okay. Like, I mean, when I was up in the Northern Rivers, well, I was in Corokai, you have people come up to you. I remember who was very distraught, but you don't hide from that. You face into it and you listen to people. That's the number one job of a leader, is to listen to people and understand their concerns and how you can help them. You don't hide away from that. You don't choreograph that. Now, that means it might look slightly awkward sometimes in the nightly news, so be it. That's part of public life.
Have you thought about maybe a trip on Sydney's public transport system, the train?
Absolutely. And obviously,
Alex.
what was that? With
With
Alex.
Alex.
With Alex.
Yeah.
Look, obviously we're in the Fair Work Commission today, and that will be determined. I appreciate that the union has put more services on. We shouldn't have had to get to the Fair Work Commission for that point to occur. And ultimately, I'll work with whoever I need to work with to get the best public transport system in place for our people. And it's disappointing that Labor's unions are sitting there playing politics with the people of our state. This negotiation has occurred now for over 2 years. The situation is not good enough. We need to put our people first. That's what the unions need to do. That's what we're doing right now. As we've said in relation to the modification of those trains, that's an enormous concession. That concession comes at a massive cost to the taxpayers of New South Wales. But we've made that concession to also ensure we've got the best public transport system for the people of New South Wales.
Premier, just back on Windsor and the floods.
Yeah.
You're talking about building back better. Windsor, for example, has flooded for a very, very long
Yeah.
time. How is that possible? How is it possible for us to build back better there when there is just this historically proven record of flooding there? Isn't it better to start to shift people out of there?
No, I mean, Windsor's a great historic town for our state and for our country. It's multifaceted. There's a whole range of things that we can do to ensure greater resilience for our communities when these flood events occur. There is no doubt that residents in the Hawkesbury are very aware of the regular nature of flooding events. They happen, and they've happened since the start of time. But there are things that we can do. We've talked about raising the Warragamba Dam to protect downstream. Certainly don't want to see that. That's going to lead to greater development and put more people at risk. So that has to be done in a measured way, working closely with the Commonwealth on those planning and environmental issues that are in place there. No, you can always make, you can always do things that ensure greater resilience in our communities. I think what we'll get back in terms of the review into the Northern Rivers, that's obviously focused as well on the response and what we can do better on the response, but on the recovery. And the government will look at ways in which we can ensure that as we continue development, and Sydney's going to grow, New South Wales is going to grow over time, but we do so in a way that is smarter than we've done in the past. And that means building in places going forward where there is less risk.
But there would be people who would say, well, we were allowed to build on this
Yeah.
more riskier land from councils back in the day.
Yeah.
I mean, should they be allowed for compensation? What did they do now? They were allowed to build there at a time when these risks were clearly not addressed.
Well, I think we need to look at everything going forward, but there are always, we have to accept there will always be floods, there will always be bushfires, there's always going to be difficult natural disasters that we have to deal with. But in terms of planning, to the question, in terms of planning, well, I think we need to be a lot smarter about where we build going forward. Now, in terms of going back, we'll look at some of those challenges in relation specifically to the Northern Rivers. I want to make sure, for example, Lismore continues to be a flourishing town in the Northern Rivers, but we need to make sure that we make changes that when the next flood occurs, we're in a much better position than we've been so in the past. So, and Gary, always things that we can do. I want to look at that review that comes back and ways in which we can do things better going forward. I think planning is crucial in that space. And you can't have a situation where your planning approvals allow people, more often than not, to be building in flood-prone areas. And then you have a situation like this. Not only does that cause devastation for residents, but also for taxpayers. To your question, in terms of coming in and providing financial support, which we do. We do every single natural disaster, and we do so for a reason, because our budget's here to help our people.
On Warragamba Dam and raising that, do you have any timeline on when we might have a commitment or any kind of promise or decision making? Obviously, it's in conjunction with the federal government. Do you have a timeline?
Well, we've submitted our request to Infrastructure Australia for a 50-50 funding arrangement. We've put business case work together on that. There are complex areas, particularly in relation to environment and planning concerns, and it's a very difficult engineering feat to raise that wall, and changes would need to be made. But it's a project this government is committed to. We've written to the Commonwealth Government under the previous government with Infrastructure Australia, and I know that Minister Ayres is in contact with his counterpart, Minister King, in Canberra in relation to that important project.
There's been a 40% female pre-selection target announced for the New South Wales Liberal Party today. Why a target and not a quota? Do you think it will be strong enough to actually increase female representation in your party?
I do. I think a target's important. Obviously, in the Liberal Party, the basis of the membership is that it's that the members have a vote in who their candidate is, and I think that's an important change that we've made. Now, I think what's pleasing from what I've read in the Daily Telegraph this morning, that there are a lot of candidates coming forward to run for the seat of Vaucluse, and a lot of high-profile women, talented women putting their hands up to run for pre-selection. That's incredibly positive. And obviously, these are matters for the Liberal Party, but I don't, as I've said, I don't think the party has done well in the past in terms of pre-selecting high calibre, high quality women for the Parliament, or to run for the Liberal Party for the Parliament. So from what I read this morning, I'm actually very encouraged, not just in terms of the calibre of the candidates, but the fact that people want to put their hands up to run for public life, because politics is a tough job, and it's tough on families. And I think the fact that many people want to run for the Liberal Party and represent the seat of Vaucluse at the next election is very pleasing.
I know
Last
40%
question,
for a
guys,
target.
thank you.
Shouldn't it be 50%? I mean, 40 isn't exactly ambitious.
Look, these are matters for the Liberal Party. I've said that we need to do better, and I think this is a good.
Should it be better than 40% though?
Look, I wouldn't put a number on it. I think what's most important for me is that we have more women and greater diversity in the Parliament representing the Liberal Party. I think that's very clear. I've made that point numerous times, and I think what I saw this morning for those people who want to put their hands up is incredibly encouraging. So I wouldn't put a number on it. What's more important is the outcome and having greater diversity in the parliaments, and I think that makes for greater public policy decision making. When you're sitting around a cabinet table, when you're sitting around expenditure review committee, and you're having robust discussions on a whole range of matters, everyone comes to those. Everyone comes to those meetings with a different perspective, a different worldview, a different experience on life. And the greater diversity that you have in the parliaments, I think the more broader those discussions are, and the better public policy outcome at the end of it. So, as I said, I'm very pleased with what I read today, and that's now a matter for the Liberal Party for the pre-selection.
Just lastly on the trains, Premier. Sorry, Kat.
Yeah.
The union is really frustrated. I know it's before the Fair Work Commission. I know you have legal advice, but you can get legal advice in any way you want, really. Union's really frustrated. They deal with Damien Tudor, hope he goes overseas. David Elliott goes overseas. Now Natalie Ward. Is it possible for you just to sit down with the union and just sort it out for the sake of...
Oh, well, I want to sort it out. I mean, I've met with the RTBU.
But like this week...
I've met with the RTBU. The matter's in the Fair Work Commission this morning. The advice I've received is to not prejudice that hearing. So I'll follow that advice. But ultimately, I meet with a range of unions in my job. I was formerly the Industrial Relations Minister for close to 5 years.
With this issue now, the bottom line does rest with you in the end.
Yeah, and consistently, I've said I want it solved. But that doesn't mean putting it at the expense, the taxpayers of New South Wales. It's being fair and it's being reasonable. And in circumstances where the discussion, the last meeting I had with the RTBU and Alex Glassons was all about the NIF, we then commit to modifying perfectly good trains from the approved by the National rail safety regulator, which I assume knows a thing or two about safety, given its title. And they have said those trains are safe and meet the standards to be running on the network. Now, we then conceded and said, okay, and that was my decision when I balanced everything up from both the Minister Tudor, Minister Elliott, the Treasurer, and went, now we'll modify those trains. We'll modify those trains because it's in the best interest of the people of New South Wales to get them on the tracks. And then as soon as that happened, that wasn't good enough. So I don't want further industrial action. I don't want commuters affected. I'll do everything I can to ensure that we get the trains on the tracks running at a full-scale operation. But I need to balance that up with ensuring the people of New South Wales are not put out in such a way financially that makes it difficult to do so. So
driverless.
No, no. Well, look, I want the best network possible, and the job of the government is to provide the highest quality services for the people of our state. And there are always vested interests in that. My job is to get the best system operating as quickly as possible, and that's what I'm committed to do.
Thanks. Everybody. Thank you.